Okay. Good evening. My name is Angela Laporte, and I'm the current Director of Art Education at the University of Arkansas School of Art. And this lecture is supported by the Walton Family Charitable Support Foundation and the Art Education Program. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional homelands and territories of the local indigenous peoples, including the Osage, Caddo, Quapaw nations, where the University of Arkansas is currently located. A portion of the Trail of Tears runs through this campus where the Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations passed through during a forced removal. By acknowledging the past, we recognize our responsibilities in relation to ongoing settler colonialism that eradicates indigenous peoples, cultures, and languages, as well as those colonial projects that dispossess indigenous lands. This statement is an invitation to recognize indigenous presence now in our communities and to reckon possible ways to support indigenous survivance. I am now pleased to introduce you to our guest speaker, Jocelyn Salaz. Jocelyn was born and raised in Cuba, New Mexico, the homeland of the Dene. She received a BA, FA in art history and an MA in art education from the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, homeland of the Pueblo of Sandia. She taught elementary and some high school art classes for Cuba independent schools for 6 years and currently works as an elementary art educator at Puesta del Sol Elementary School in Rio Rancho, New Mexico on Pueblo homelands. While attending graduate school at UNM, she worked with teens and small children at Enlace Comunitario, an organization in Albuquerque that provides domestic violence services to Spanish-speaking women and children. The work included running groups for small children about safety in the home and exploring different aspects of healthy relationships with teenagers. She has been in the Art 21 Educators Program since 2010. First as part of the second cohort of teachers to go through the program, then serving as a mentor and presenting and participating in Art 21 Summer Institutes. Her work is included in the NAEA's Culturally Sensitive Art Education in a Global World, a book edited by Manifold, Willis, and Zimmerman. She has displayed art at the University of New Mexico, John Summers Gallery, and the National Hispanic Cultural Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She attended Arquitopia's International Art Residency in Puebla, Mexico twice in 2014 and 2019 to study gold leaf techniques and art and activism, and was invited into its current alumni honors online residency program, which will culminate in a residency in Oaxaca, Mexico in 2023. I am now pleased to introduce you to our guest, Jocelyn Salaz.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get started. So my name is Jocelyn. The title of my presentation tonight is Teaching as Process. And this comes from one of my mentors, this idea of teaching being a process and the process of developing as a teacher. I've been teaching for a lot of years. I always forget how many years it's been, but every year I'm learning something new and changing my teaching practice. And so today I'm going to talk about teaching art and social justice in the elementary art classroom. And so before I begin, I would like to do my land acknowledgement. So I am presenting today from Albuquerque, and I currently teach in Rio Rancho, both on the ancestral Pueblo Indian homelands currently inhabited by the pueblos of Sandia, Santa Ana, and Isleta. I grew up on Diné or Navajo homelands, which is now called Cuba. New Mexico, my home, has been colonized twice. First by the Spanish in 1598, led by Juan de Oñate, who killed and tortured New Mexico's native inhabitants. During the Pueblo Revolution of 1680, Pueblo Indian groups in New Mexico resisted Spanish rule and drove them out of New Mexico. However, in 1692, Don Diego de Vargas returned violently to New Mexico to colonize the area again. Under Spanish rule, Pueblo Indian people were killed, mistreated, and made to pay tribute to the Spanish. The second colonization occurred in 1848 when a large part of the Southwest was ceded to the United States after the Mexican-American War. Between 1864 to 66, the Diné were displaced by the US Army from their homelands in eastern Arizona and western New Mexico to Bosque Redondo in southeast New Mexico. During this long walk, many Diné died. The Treaty of Bosque Redondo in 1868 established the Navajo Reservation, and survivors returned to their homelands. New Mexico became a state a year after my grandparents were born in 1912. I want to acknowledge that I am a daughter of both the colonizer, my Spanish ancestors, and the people they colonized, my Native American ancestors. I do not have cultural ties with, nor can I identify the tribes of my Native ancestors. This erasure was intentional. I honor them by acknowledging this painful history. Dr. Laporte went over some biographical information about me. I obtained my art history degree and my master's in art education from UNM. And I taught in Cuba independent schools. That's where I began my teaching career, and currently work in Rio Rancho at Puesta del Sol Elementary School. And I did work with Enlace and also Art 21 educators. And all of these experiences have been very instrumental in my teaching practice. So this is, I was raised in Cuba, New Mexico, and this photograph shows us looking east toward the town of Cuba. So Cuba is a really small town in northern New Mexico. The population is about 700. Like within the city limits, but it's a center for some of the smaller communities that are around it. So these communities are Hispanic, and it's on the border of the Navajo Reservation, the checkerboard area of the Navajo Reservation, and also the Jicarilla Apache Reservation. This view, this photo was taken from my parents' home. They live in the home that my grandfather and grandmother made in around the 1950s. And this was the land that my grandmother's grandfather settled in around 1880. And so my family has lived on this land for a long time. Both of my grandfathers were sheep herders. My grandfather, Telesfor Chavez, and Mariano Salaz were both sheep herders. My grandpa Telesfor was herding sheep between Arizona and New Mexico on the Navajo Reservation, across the Navajo Reservation. And so the cultural ties that I have are created through sheep culture. So there's a lot of interaction between my family, specifically my grandfather Telesvod's family, with people coming in from the Navajo Reservation. And so he would sell sheep, and then he would have people come in and shear his sheep. And so there is this relationship through sheep culture. There's also really interesting in my own personal work. There's also very interesting connections between the weaving cultures of Hispanic, Pueblo Indian, and Navajo people in New Mexico, and they're usually talked about as very separate. But right now I'm looking into the commonalities because they are very much interrelated and interwoven. So I started my career with Cuba Independent Schools, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about the breakdown of the population in Cuba. And these statistics are from 2021, and a little bit has changed since I was in school and I was teaching. Most notably, we have a bigger Asian population, but so you can see most of the population of the school is American Indian, so mostly from the Navajo Reservation. And then we have 23% of Hispanic students, 3.1% white, and 1.5% Asian. So these are the demographics, about the demographics that I was working with when I was working in Cuba. A lot of the students in Cuba have a low economic status, so there's a lot of poverty. So most of the kids for years received free lunches because of this. Right now I'm at Puesta del Sol Elementary School, and even though Cuba and Rio Rancho are both in Sandoval County, Rio Rancho is more of like an urban area. So it's in the Albuquerque metro area. So there's a large population of students. I went from Cuba, I had like 180 students at the elementary student to like having like 700 to 800 students in Rio Rancho. So it's a really large school. These are the demographics of the school. The assistant principal referred me to these statistics. The other ones were from the New Mexico Public Education Department. And so at my current school, the population is 27% white, 65.7% Latino Hispanic, 4.4% two or more races, 2.1% American Indian, and 0.9% Black or African American. And I'm not sure how these groups are, how people identified. So we have Latinos from the Caribbean that are also Black, and I don't know if they specify which category. So and more than half of our schools economically disadvantaged. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my teaching from before. I think Art 21 educators, so Art 21 is the PBS program that interviews contemporary artists and shows them working and talking about their practice. And so they have a really strong educators group. And before I attended the Art 21 Educators Summer Institute, I would describe my curriculum as project-based. So I would think about a project and what it might look like, and I'd identify artists around the main theme or the big idea, and then I'd plug in like elements and principles and techniques and materials. And while I like to go deep with students and I liked, open-ended questions, I still feel like there was a strong emphasis on the end product. And so with Art 21 educators, I shifted from like a project-based more towards an emphasis on process. So the unit of study that I developed during my initial year was centered around play as part of the creative process. And it was based on like my own memories of being a child and the magic that I experienced when I was a kid and I was playing and making my own toys and playthings. And so so I worked with high school students this year or during my year of Art 21 educators, and we were introduced to the open-ended art plays such as Oliver Herring's Task, and we played with color and collage and then puppet animations in this unit about play. And so the focus was more on like thinking about success and failure and how we move on from failure. And so this emphasis on process kind of spread to all of my teaching. So in place of like defining an end product, we started working more with around things or concepts. And so part of our Art 21 educators group includes an elementary group, and we've talked about specifically how we can address social justice in elementary art classrooms, because some conversations are difficult and really complex to have with elementary students. So talking about systemic racism, I mean, they can understand some concepts, but it's a lot trickier than talking with a different level of students. And so we began to start thinking about how we could start addressing these things in different ways in the elementary classroom. And so, recently there's a discussion about, how the big question is like, how young is too young to learn about racism, when we know that a lot of students actually experience racism even before they're born. Or they experience the effects. And so I wanted to think of ways that I could address social justice in my classroom in ways that were developmentally appropriate with the students. And so the way I do this is I'm in this presentation, I'm going to focus on 4 questions that I've kind of used to guide my practice. What stories are missing from history books and school curriculum, and why? What are the different aspects of my identity? Whose images are missing from popular visual culture, and why? And how can we address this absence? And then how can I transform my own world with what I have around me? So I'm going to begin with stories. What stories are missing from history books and school curriculum, and why? And I'm going to talk about 3 teachers that were very instrumental in helping me to understand this concept of stories and, what stories are told via history mostly. And so the three teachers that I'm going to talk about, the first one is Pita Martinez McDonald. Miss McDonald was my 3rd and 5th grade teacher in elementary school in Cuba. Her family was from Los Alamos. And then later, when I began my student teaching, I actually got to work beside her because I did my student teaching in Cuba elementary schools. And so one of the things that I found really interesting that I know a lot of students don't have the fortune of having in their education is Miss McDonald would teach us about local folklore and stories. And so we studied cuentos, which are like Hispanic stories that come from New Mexico. And we also, I'll never forget the year that we learned about the legend of the Navajo hero twins. And so, so the story is about the sons of changing woman and the sun. And so these twins go in search of their father. They want to know who their father is. And their father is kind of like not sure if he trusts them. And so they have to go through all these different like feats to prove that they're worthy of their father. And so during the time they set off to find their father, there were large giants that were destroying the people. And so they slay one of these giants and they threw his head into the landscape, and it became known as the cabezon. So I have a picture that I took of the cabezon when I was traveling one day. And so right here on this, it's on my right side, you can see this small, it looks small here, volcanic formation in the landscape. So Cabezon is located in between Cuba and Rio Rancho. And so I would see this as I was driving, or as my parents were driving us like to and from Albuquerque as a child. And so I was very familiar with this with this landscape and this landform. And so cabezon in Spanish means big head, and it got its name from this legend of the Navajo hero twins. And I will never forget learning this in elementary. And I don't think a lot of people get this type of local Native American history. And so it was something that I was really fortunate to have as a young student. The second teacher I'm going to talk about is Esther Cordova May. We called her Miss May when I was in school. She was born in Cuba. She earned a master's degree in folklore at the University of California, Berkeley. And in 1981, she moved back to Cuba with her husband to manage their cattle ranch. And her husband were teachers at my school. And so Miss May was my middle school teacher. And again, the thing that I remember about Miss May's teaching is she studied local history with us, and in her telling of this history, the Spanish weren't the heroes that maybe most of the community, the inner community in Cuba, which was mostly Hispanic. So her telling wasn't like the Spanish were heroes. She, in her telling of history and her teaching of history, we learned about Native American tradition and history from before contact and then through contact. And so her focus wasn't on showing the Spanish as heroes, but more a telling of this colonial history. And then she also, every year she would award a student with a citizenship award. And so what she was looking for was not just like academic excellence, but also how these students, what type of community members they were. And I think that, that was really inspiring to me because it was also just like on a more personal level instead of an academic type of thing. So she was looking for students that that showed concern for their communities. And she also, I'll never forget an instant where one of my classmates was making racist jokes, and she gently called this student out on what they were doing. She did it in a way to where it wasn't a shameful experience, but more of a learning experience. But she was very adamant that that type of thing wouldn't happen in her classroom. And that really stuck out with me throughout my learning career. And so I was really fortunate to have these amazing teachers as a youngster. And then the next teacher that I'm going to talk about is Dr. Kirsten Piebewick. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of Chicago and her MA and PhD in art history from the University of Michigan. And so she studied Italian at the University of Chicago and then went into art history. And she combined her Italian background with her art history background with her study of Mary Edmonia Lewis. And she wrote the book Child of the Fire. And so Mary Edmonia Lewis was had a Chippewa mother and an African-American father. And she began to study art in the United States, and then she went to Rome, and that's where most of her career happened. She created a lot of work for abolitionist patrons, and then later on in her career, she created work for Catholic patrons. And so I'm going to come back to this slide. So this is a photograph of a sculpture that Mary Edmonia Lewis created called Forever Free in 1867. And so in looking at Mary Edmonia Lewis's work, it's always noted that her women have more European features, facial features, and her men are usually more racialized. So right here we see these are freed enslaved people, And we can see that the man has curly hair and this like strong physique. And then the woman is a lot smaller than him, but also has European features. And so in discussing why Mary Edmonia Lewis would do such a thing, she talked about the risk that the public would view these works as autobiographical, and Lewis not wanting these works to be viewed as autobiographical. And so she separated herself from her American Indian heritage and African American heritage by Europeanizing the features. So she talked about this in terms of a strategy that she had. And so I'm going to go back to this slide. So a couple of the important learnings that I got from Dr. Buick was that we perform identity, and people will constantly try to pigeonhole us into a certain identity when in fact we are, it's something that we perform or that people want us to perform. And we have to figure out what is our, what are the different aspects of our identity, because it's never authentic. There's never like one authentic part of your identity, because and this leads to the second important thing I learned from her. People are all in process. We are all in process, constantly learning and constantly changing. And so these three women provided these stories that I don't think I would have learned from the mainstream. And they also discussed why these stories are not talked about, because, you know, in the United States, our history is the history of European colonization and expansion across the North America is celebrated as something that was supposed to happen and that was good. And in fact, there were many people that suffered because of the colonization and the expansion. So taking all this, I wanted to work with what are the different aspects of my identity as a driving question for my students. And so the best way that I found to address this question was through clothing. So I created a paper doll or like paper people unit for my students, and during which we would talk about clothing, because clothing is something that we can express identity with, and depending on what we're wearing, people might read it in various ways, right? And also we become different people when we're wearing different clothing. I mean, when you think about like wearing a costume where maybe people don't know who you are versus presenting on Zoom and what you would wear for that, they would be very different things, right? So this kind of goes with that idea that like identity is performed and identity is changing. We as people are constantly changing. And so I worked with my students. I created this fashion design unit. So when I was working in Cuba during my student teaching, we would have every year there was a culture day. We had a Spanish bilingual program, and we also had a Navajo bilingual program. And so both of these groups would perform on these culture days, and there was also like art and music and poetry that was shared during these days. And so the students were familiar with dressing up in these different types of clothing for performing. And so this is the Spanish bilingual class, and then our Navajo bilingual class would also perform. And so they would bring the clothing in from home, and so there was often stories behind the clothing. And so I use this as a way to introduce students to this idea about thinking about clothing, because I knew this was like such an important experience for the students, but I also didn't necessarily like encourage them to recreate this type of clothing in any way. So we talked about their clothing, and then we talked about clothing in terms of form and what something looks like. and function, what it is used for. So like for protection, to disguise, to transform, to hide. And then we would go through and look at different types of clothing, like a firefighter, and how does its function affect its form, like these bright yellow stripes, making it easier for people to see them, or the helmet protecting their head. And then sports uniforms, in terms of protection and identifying teams. Um, Halloween costumes, like for fun, and how they might feel when they have a mask on and people don't know who they are, or how they feel different when they take on like this different character. And then I also open it up to students, what type of clothing do you wear that's special, and how does it make you feel? So I remember one student said, well, when I go hunting, I wear camouflage and it makes me feel sneaky. And so there's a lot of like really interesting conversation around the clothing. And then I think it's important. I wanted to introduce students to Native American clothing, not necessarily like from the area, because they were pretty familiar with local clothing traditions, but I didn't learn about Native North America until I took art history in college. And so I introduced some of these groups via clothing. So this is the Kwak Waka Wak button robe. And so we talked about the development of crest imagery and its significance for familial and cultural history, and how it was worn during potlatch ceremonies. And then I showed students this Naskapi Inu summer hunting coat, and I talked about the subarctic spiritual beliefs, because they lived in such a harsh climate, and hunting was so important in terms of providing resources for people in terms of food and clothing and shelter. And so they would paint these caribou skins to create jackets for the hunters, and they wanted to make them beautiful so that the animal spirits would want to give themselves to the hunters. And so it would give the hunter confidence to wear this beautiful jacket. So the beauty of the painting actually like was part of the function. So this is where like function and form really intertwine. And I also talked about how the cut of the coat came from the French, and so this was kind of like the hybridization of two cultures coming together. So there's a strong tendency when talking about Native American art to like deem certain art like inauthentic because it has European influences, and in a way that I think is really unfair to Native artists. I mean, and this happens with Hispanic artists like such as myself in New Mexico. And so so after talking about this, these works and learning more about them, we did a figure study where students were thinking about proportion. So we did a front view, and this is an example of one of those drawings that one of my students did. And then we did a running view. And so for the final project, students got to, she chose the running view for the final project, but students got to ask another friend to model for them in like some type of action that would match one of the ideas they had for their clothing. And so students created, they would create the paper doll or the paper person, and then they would trace the paper doll onto another piece of paper and cut that out, and then glue a new outfit onto that backing that they could put over their paper person. And it was really important to me that they it wasn't like a permanent outfit, because I wanted them to be able to put different outfits on and take them off, similar to the way we put certain clothing on and then change into something else for whatever it is that we're doing. And so like we can see this student, her original idea was soccer, but then we also see this like pink skirt and really delicate sparkly scarf. And so we can see right here just how much this clothing might change their identity or how they're feeling or what they're doing at the time. And we talked about these, how do you feel when you're wearing this? And we had some really interesting discussions. So this is another student. Her process was super playful, and she took a lot of risks with the outfits that she created. She started off with the NDI uniform because that was something she really enjoyed, and then she really she created a lot of outfits, and there was a lot of joy in watching her process. And then every year that I've done this, I've had students who create clothing for as a way, I think, of maybe exploring their own identity. So like I'll have boys who will create skirts or dresses for their boy paper doll, or girls that create like more like what we would say masculine type of clothing for their doll. And so this one year, this student created these dresses, and I had some other students, talking about like, why is he making dresses for his? And so we had that discussion about being respectful and how clothing is for all people. And, I made it clear that we weren't going to make fun of students for the clothing that they created for their paper dolls. And so I think this is really important in fostering like a safe place for LGBTQ students. And we start to see this in the elementary now, like we've had some trans students, and so we've talked about how we can best support them and provide a safe space for them. So I'm going to move on to visual culture and whose images are missing from popular visual culture and why, and how can we address this absence. So I'm going to start off by explaining my color unit, and then it'll become more clear how I'm incorporating different types of people into my art curriculum. So I'm really interested in color as an artist. Like, of course, it's one of the things that I find the most interesting about creating art, and I love lots of colors. And so I thought I would explore it with my elementary students. And so I created a color unit, and we started off with, what do you know about color? What do you want to know? And why should we explore or study color? So student responses were like, they wanted to know, how do we see colors? What makes color? How many colors are there? What about new colors? How do we name colors? And what are colors in different languages? What colors can we make? What combinations can we use for mixing new colors? What colors can I use for different shapes? What shade do you use at the right time? And they all expressed they wanted to work well with color. And so so I found a video that teaches the scientific aspect of seeing color in terms of like pigment and how it's reflected back to the eye and what happens in the brain. So it's a short, fun video for students to look at. And then we ran through the history of paint. So I introduced Rembrandt, and then we talked about like the color and when they thought it was created. And then I explained how paints were made. And so like with the grinding and mixing them in with the binder. So we talked about pigment and binder. And then we looked at Van Gogh and his colors and talked about what was the difference between his colors and Rembrandt. And then students, and then I explained that during the time that Van Gogh was working, they had made advances in paint making. So they could now create synthetic paint and package it in these metal tubes, which made it easier for artists to use, and also, created brighter colors. And then I introduced them to Michelle Wood's self-portrait, and we talked about acrylic colors. So again, we talked about what the colors in her painting look like. And then I introduced them to acrylic paints in terms of this new like liquid plastic that you can now put pigments in and use as paint, and how such a wide variety of colors is now available with acrylic paints. So we talked about how the pigments in these paints works in terms of how they can see. We talked about how they new colors are discovered. So I showed this short video about the new blue that was discovered a few years ago. By now, it's a few years. And so then a big part of this unit was driven by my experience at Arquetopia in Puebla when I studied gold leaf and natural pigments. So I worked with cochinilla or cochineal, and it's made from the body of a bug. And in Mexico, there's these huge farms where they raise cacti, and then they introduce these bugs to the cacti, and they're basically parasites. And so then at the end of the season, they gather them, they process them, and you can crush them into a fine powder, and they're mostly used as dyes. I use them as a paint, but they're technically dyes. And so depending on what you mix cochinilla with, you will get different colors. So you mix it with water, you'll get like this purpley gray. Citric acid, you get a red scarlet color. Baking soda gives you a purple. I found that when you mix alum and citric acid, you can get a bright magenta. So I was extremely fascinated by this. And so I talked to students about the creation of this paint, and they were originally, this type of dye or paint was originally used by Native Americans before European contact. And in fact, like they were, cochinilla was something that was demanded as tribute by the Mexica. And then later when the Spanish came in, it was demanded as tribute for them. And it was one of Mexico's most important exports during the colonial era. And so it went all around the world. And currently it's used in like as a color for drinks, in cosmetics. So I introduced this to students, and I think it's important because I didn't learn about this until I was an adult. And I think this Native American knowledge is really important for students to have access to. This was also used a lot in like the religious paintings in New Mexico during the colonial time. So this is the work that I produced. I made this, I did a series of 20 paintings on my grandfather that I didn't know he died before I was born. And so these paintings were based on a photograph that was really faded. And it was like the picture that I had of my grandfather in my head when I was growing up. And there was a lot that I couldn't see from it. And it also kind of faded to like a reddish purple color, which was the same color palette that I was working with when I was working with the cochinilla. So I show this work to students, and I also introduced indigo into my painting practice. So this is a portrait I painted of my father, and indigo has a lot of, its history is very much tied to enslavement and then later working class, the denim, indigo dyed denim. And so a lot of these ideas are used in this painting. So I brought in the cochineal to my students at school. So they got to grind the bugs and then mix them with different solutions and create paintings. So this is one of the paintings that one of my students created. And then we did a color challenge where students got to experiment with a lot of different colors. So all through the unit, students are really trying to explore color in different ways to kind of answer some of those questions that they had at the beginning. This is Olivia Goody's Freeform Color Investigations. So this one kind of addresses that, like, where do I put colors, you know, what looks right and that type of thing. So we worked with complementary colors and then accent color. And then I introduced students to Frida Kahlo. when we were talking about self-portraiture, and I also like introduced a little bit of her biography. She's actually very popular in visual culture, but many people don't really know a lot about her. Then during the next part, the students were going to create a self-portrait selfie. So I gave them like some parameters for taking their selfie, and some of them took them at home with their parents' phone, and then their parents emailed me the picture. And then I had some kids use my phone to take a picture in the classroom. And then I printed these all out. And so I talked to students about using photography as part of their artwork. And so I think a lot of times the students were like, well, we're just using this photo. Like, where's the art behind it? And so we talked about Oliver Herring and Tim Hawkinson and their work with photography. And then as we started painting, I introduced them to Byron Kim, and what he does is he gets these different skin tones from his friends, and he paints them on a panel, and then he puts all these panels together, and you get to see visually like what the variation is between people's skin tones. And during this time, I also talked a little bit about like the scientific background on skin color and how it comes from like sun exposure and where your ancestors lived and that type of thing, so that students were didn't kind of had a context for skin color and why people have different skin colors. And then I introduced them to Angelica Das, and I showed them clips from her TED talk on her projects. And so what she does, she's a Brazilian photographer, and she takes photographs of people, and then she takes a small area on their nose, and she takes the color from that spot and changes the background, and then she matches it to a Pantone color. And then she puts all these people into a background with their skin color in these grids, and she was putting them up in cities and galleries and all these places. And in her talk, she addresses the social aspects of skin color and how people are treated. And so we have a discussion about that. And so it's really interesting to see her process in terms of taking the photographs and creating these images, telling her story, and then later on going into classrooms and working with students. So finally, I introduced Kerry James Marshall, and he talks about how he makes his people emphatically Black. And so he's not working on realism, he's working on this idea of Black, and his characters are literally Black. And so we talked about just the variety of skin tones and how the social consequences of racism, but also how all these skin tones should be celebrated. And then students get a chance to mix their own skin tone. And so these were some of the portraits that were created during this lesson. And I also work with younger students. This one is from a first grade student. So we worked on self-portraits, and then I showed the students different ways to make different skin tones with the watercolors. And we had an amazing time. This first grade was a bilingual class, and they have a variety. Some of the students' families are from Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. So I worked with these students, and they were pretty sensitive to the color of their skin, and they we're really good at recreating that with the watercolors. So we had a big variety of skin tones with this class. So and the artists that I presented to those students, and also letting them be artists themselves, I think it was a strong way to address like who is represented, who can be represented. And also like, I just really like introducing students to artists that aren't like the mainstream white European male, although they're like included sometimes. The main artists that I like to introduce come from different backgrounds. So I'm going to end with strategies and how can I transform my own world with what I have around me. And so this comes from my discovery of Amalia Mesa Baines and her ideas about around the word domesticana. So she coined this phrase to talk about this aesthetic that she was raised with, where women, she was raised in a Chicano household. And so women were in charge of these home altars. And so these home altars were like a center of spirituality and power for women. And they were usually created using photographs and women's crafts, with cloth, paper, that type of thing. And so it was, she talks about this being an aesthetic where you take, what little you have and you make something amazing and beautiful and powerful with that, humble materials into something that's really meaningful and important. And so her work influenced me a lot as an artist and as a teacher. And then I found Pepón Osorio's work, and I was fortunate to talk to him when he had an exhibition in Albuquerque. And I talked to him about how it is that he's able to connect so strongly with the work that he makes when it's about other people. And he told me it was through the objects. And so he uses a lot of like mass produced objects that that people bring into their home. And then, it might start off in this big factory, but how you use it changes its meaning. And so I was really drawn to that idea, and he's Afro-Caribbean. And then Al Anatsui, the Ghanaian artist. I was also like really interested in his work. I saw his work at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, or the Brooklyn Art Museum. And it was amazing because he's basically taking what is considered by many to be trash and turning them into these ethereal works. Like it's so beautiful and it's large in scale, and it's just so amazing that he's making something so beautiful with trash. So I find this strategy of using like these humble materials really interesting. And so I thought of it in terms of my own practice. I'm going to skip over this, but I introduced this idea of transformation to students. I show them Al Onatsui's work, and then students use paper, just plain paper that we have in the classroom, to create amazing sculptures. So they're transforming something that's very flat into something that's very three-dimensional and interesting. And so these are some of the examples of student work. We did work on the home. So students would bring in a toy from their home and any other objects that they thought would be helpful to create a home for their toy. And this is some of the work that they created. And this project was also really interesting during the pandemic when students were at home, and some of them had art materials. We provided a sketchbook and some paints to students, but we also did work where students could use materials from their homes. And so this was a really interesting connection because they were in their homes making these homes for a toy with stuff that they had readily available in their homes. So that was a really interesting thing to see during the pandemic. And then we make these like robot sculptures from the cardboard boxes that students collect from home. So what's next? I feel like my teaching, of course, is always a process. And right now, like during the pandemic, I really felt like I was on survival mode. And I found myself sometimes just doing like, if I was working on a lesson for this grade level, the other lessons for my other students were like, YouTube videos I found from other art educators. So I was really survival mode. And so now that things are kind of settling down, I'm thinking about curriculum that allows even more choices for students in terms of what they want to make and what they want to explore, student-driven projects. So I want to learn more about teaching or TAB, teaching artistic behavior, but I also want to be really mindful of, these stories and the artists that I present to my students and like different strategies. So that's kind of where I'm at in terms of my teaching practice. So we can end here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I can take questions if you all have any questions.
Thank you so much.
I don't have any questions, but I did want to say I thought that the clothing project where you like had the students do that was super interesting, and like that's just like such a fun way that I wouldn't have thought about like how to incorporate like parts of their culture and like get them thinking about just different things, and like even thinking about like the utility of clothing and how you went into that. And also just all your projects were so thorough. Like it just seems like you really did the prepping to know what you were talking about, and like to not just include like one culture or one thing, but like allowing people to like think about a lot of different, like wherever anyone could be from, like really exploring the range within that, which I thought was really cool. So yeah, I loved it.
Thank you. Right before the pandemic started, like in March, like students had already started bringing in, I wanted to do a unit where students would personalize clothing with sewing. So fourth grade would sew stuffed animals. So I was working with the fifth graders and they were going to bring in articles of clothing. Some of them already started bringing them in, and they were going to create like a patch or embroidery on their clothing using the sewing skills that we learned the previous year. And so I was really excited because then they would actually get to personalize a piece of clothing that they could wear, and the students were really excited. And then that week we were told we're taking 2 weeks off, and then it turned into the whole year. So that's something that I'm looking forward to doing this year, actually, because I think it's really exciting, and I think the students thought it was exciting that they could change their own clothing. That says a lot. I think it's really powerful. So that's one way that I want to extend this idea of clothing with my students. Are there any other questions or comments?
Well, I have a question. I was wondering what gave you like the courage to transition from what you used to teach or the style that you used to teach into a more process-oriented and social justice-oriented type of teaching?
It was a number of things. When I started my art history program in college, I knew I wanted to teach art. So I loved art history, but I also knew that I wanted to teach art. And so the program at UNM is it's very progressive, the art history department. So they're talking about colonization, and these issues were important to me because I felt the effects of being a Hispanic woman growing up like in school, especially like when I was in science fair during my, when I was in school, in high school, how people would treat me and what people expected of me there. And so it was important to me. And then just learning about all the true effects of colonialism. You grow up with these stories, like especially in New Mexico, there's a lot of like this Spanish pride, and people will say they're oh, I'm full Spanish, like from Spain. And when I started studying the artwork of New Mexico, I was, looking through archival stuff about genealogies and things like that. And so there's these stories that are told that just aren't true. And people suffer because of them. And so like literally going through the art history program had me thinking about how like it was like the foundation. And then I think Art 21 Educators was the second thing that was really instrumental, because people there were talking about social justice issues. And so that was like the second step. And then the final one was with my artist residency. We do a lot of reading, and we think a lot about artistic strategy. And so, and it's not necessarily like, I don't think it's enough to just say, oh, this is Pueblo potter's art, let's make a pot. I think, understanding, gaining a deeper understanding of the culture and the history of colonialism is important to understand art forms. And art forms shouldn't necessarily just be copied. Ideas like, that's how come I really like the clothing unit, is because it's not just specific to like one culture. It's specific. I mean, clothing is something that everybody has. And so it opens kids up to decide what parts of my identity do I want to explore right now, rather than boxing students into, well, I better make this traditional Native American clothing that I wear during the dances. Like I had some students make things like that, but very few. A lot of them were interested in other ideas. And so I think it was just all those experiences combined that kind of gave me the bravery to do this type of work. And the school district I work at is conservative, so it's not like the work I do isn't super obvious, but I think it sends a message to students when the artists they're seeing are not dead male European artists from, the 1880s. They're seeing contemporary artists that are working with contemporary concerns that could be like identity and race. So.
Thank you. Yeah, the work you're doing is very powerful, I think. Anyone else? I'm sure there's one more question.
I was actually curious about it's kind of similar to what Dr. Laporte was asking, but the parental reception of some of the things that you teach, because I know that, like some parents are obviously going to take a huge issue with teaching things like that, especially to younger kids. And it's something that like obviously is important that happens, but we're still in that phase where you might have a lot of pushback from the parents of the students that you teach. So I'm just curious if you've ever had any like issues with that and how you might have handled it.
I haven't had that type of pushback from parents. I know like our school district is trying to make clear that our diversity, what is it, DEI, diversity,
Equity and
inclusion is not critical race theory. Like there's that emphasis at the district level. And I think because my method is a little bit more subtle, I think that it's more acceptable. So for example, when we talk about skin color, with the older ones, we talk about how people can be treated differently because of their skin color. But I don't make it exclusively about like racism. I make it more about like celebrating the different skin tones that we have, but acknowledging that skin tone is related to racism. And I haven't had a lot of pushback on that, like from parents. when I was teaching in Cuba, there's a lot more openness to, because the school serves such a high Native American population, they really try to include a lot of that respect for the culture within the district. So recently, my sister's now the principal of the elementary school, and they were doing training with UNM education department in terms of celebrating the cultures at the high school. And so the teachers were trained, and then they created modules for the students to learn more about local history, Hispanic and Native American. So they're a lot more open there, and I just haven't had a lot of pushback. We have, we do have immigrant students. So because of our bilingual program that promotes a lot of understanding that these cultures need to be respected. We have a Native American group, so I've done painting projects, after school painting projects with them. But I just haven't had a lot of pushback in terms of, because I think I do it in a subtle way where I'm not outright saying like, we're not going to look at European artists, we're going to look at these artists of color. I don't label it like that. I just introduce the artist and talk about their work with students. And so I haven't gotten brave enough, I guess, to really confront some of these issues with the elementary students in a more obvious way.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I appreciate that comment about like, it's just the lens through which you teach it is important, like the nuance to, we're not just saying, white people are bad, because obviously that is, it's going to make a lot of people really upset, and teaching from that negative perspective rather than let's focus on positive aspects of other cultures. It's not about necessarily shoving people out of the picture as much as it's about bringing more people into it, which I appreciate that kind of nuance to that, because it's like, especially as you teach kids who are older and older and have strong opinions about everything, it becomes harder, I feel like, to talk about it sometimes without risking stuff. So I guess, I appreciate knowing that if I look at it that way, as teaching it through a positive lens rather than a negative one, helps to have those conversations in a more professional way, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I was able to have some more in-depth conversations when I taught at the high school. And it wasn't an issue because, again, the Native American students, because it's most of our population in Cuba schools, it's really important to create like a learning environment for them where they feel safe. And so I began to start to talk about these issues with high school students. Like we did a project about beauty and what's considered attractive. And some really interesting things came up about gender and also like how Native American people are portrayed. And so, they were a little bit, the students themselves were a little bit shy and uncomfortable about discussing it because I don't know how many people like discussed it in terms of like appearances and visual culture with them, but it was really interesting. And I think they have like, again, with elementary students, there's some things that are simple that they can like understand, but then there's a lot of complexity that is really hard to address with elementary students. And I only see them like once for 40 minutes every 6 days. Whereas with high school, I could develop a relationship with them. So it's a little bit easier to do that type of conversation with high school, a lot harder with elementary. And so I try to, I feel with elementary students, in terms of like, for example, skin color, I think it's really important for them to embrace their skin color and not think of one as better than the other. And then like in terms of like identity, like I think it's important for them to understand like, I wear different clothes, there's different aspects of myself. And that kind of lays down the foundation for later thinking about your identity in terms of, you know, as they grow older, sexuality or ethnicity, and combine that with their experiences in the world.
Well,
Thank you. Those questions are good.
this is wonderful. I think I'll stop the recording.